Currently, buried within the stored recordings of a legislative session that has already garnered millions of views, exists a sequence lasting under 30 seconds that somehow encapsulates everything flawed and everything promising regarding American politics simultaneously. A politician who has dedicated almost 20 years to utilizing interruptions as his main legislative tool attempts the tactic once again, yet the congresswoman he targets refuses to flinch, refuses to falter, and refuses to lose her train of thought. She executes a maneuver that is significantly more potent. She leverages the tactic. She transforms the disruption into the foundation for a rebuttal that leaves the whole assembly chamber in shocked quiet, a rebuttal that spreads across all social networks within hours, and one that individuals who missed the live broadcast cannot stop rewatching once they discover it. Should you be a new viewer here, smash that subscribe icon immediately and press the like feature before we proceed any further, simply because whatever we are preparing to unpack warrants your absolute focus, and we plan to provide you with every solitary detail regarding how it unfolded, why it unfolded, and what it signifies for all parties involved. This remains the narrative detailing the exact instance Jim Jordan spoke over Jasmine Crockett and instantaneously, thoroughly, and forever regretted the choice. To comprehend exactly why this sequence resonated the way it truly did, you must begin where everything inside the Capitol begins, looking at the individuals involved and the backgrounds they transport into the chamber alongside them. Jim Jordan has served inside the United States House of Representatives since the year 2007. That represents roughly 20 years of legislative background, roughly 20 years of assembly sessions, and roughly 20 years of constructing and honing the distinct civic persona that has transformed him into one of the most identifiable and most divisive characters across the whole legislative sector. He functioned as a triumphant wrestler during his university years, and he has practically never ceased battling in that exact manner. His approach during assembly sessions remains combative, unyielding, and formulated upon a highly specific collection of tactics that he has utilized so reliably and so triumphantly throughout the decades that they have essentially transformed into his signature. He speaks at a high volume, and he transitions rapidly between arguments, practically never permitting a dispute to linger adequately long for the opposing faction to completely answer. He constantly interrupts. This serves as potentially his most identifiable instrument, involving the mid-sentence blockade, the speaking over someone, and the refusal to allow a reply to mature to the stage where it could legitimately contest whatever he is endeavoring to cement. For Jordan, the disruption hardly represents a violation of etiquette. Instead, it functions as a tactic representing how he dictates the speed of an interaction, how he stops testifiers and peers from formulating arguments that could muddle his storyline, and how he preserves the illusion of supremacy inside a space even when the core of whatever he is stating faces effective opposition. It has functioned incredibly successfully, spanning a remarkably extended period. Testifiers who lack preparation for the tactic freeze entirely, peers who lack comfort regarding clashes retreat, and even seasoned legislators have discovered themselves thrown off track by the distinct cadence of Jordan's disruptions, which arrive at the exact second during an argument when breaking it inflicts the maximum harm. This happens not at the start when an individual is still finding their rhythm, and not at the conclusion when the argument has finally been delivered, but squarely in the center when the reasoning is climbing toward its wrap-up, making cutting it short generate ultimate chaos. He certainly avoids doing this accidentally. He has been executing it for sufficiently long that it remains totally intentional, totally premeditated, and it embodies an authentic display of strategic intellect, even assuming it also represents, by any objective standard, a genuinely disrespectful approach toward the procedure of democratic debate. The leadership position over the House Judiciary Committee granted Jordan an even more commanding stage for these exact tactics. Acting as leader, he dominates the gavel, he dominates the clock, and he dictates exactly who communicates, at what moment, and for what duration. He establishes the parameters of the session before it even commences, and he guides its trajectory while it remains active. The organizational perks of the leadership position, paired alongside the strategic perks of his disruption-focused technique, birthed a variation of Jim Jordan who functioned inside these assembly sessions exactly as though they served as his private stadium, representing a location where he dictated the guidelines, dictated the rhythm, and dictated exactly what the interaction resembled for everybody observing from their residences. And subsequently, he encountered Jasmine Crockett. Crockett entered the legislature during 2023, serving Texas's 30th legislative zone. Prior to serving as a representative, she functioned as a civil liberties lawyer, and definitely not in the superficial or resume-inflating manner that occasionally gets linked to that label within civic profiles. She executed civil liberties litigation in the authentic manner, inside genuine judicial chambers, managing lawsuits that carried authentic consequences for authentic citizens, specifically lawsuits where the rival attorneys frequently possessed superior funding, where the magistrate occasionally proved antagonistic, where the details required assembling with absolute exactness since absolutely no room for mistakes existed, and where the capacity to process logically and reply efficiently under stress served not as a pleasant characteristic, but as an absolute occupational necessity. Decades of that specific style of labor forge a trait inside an individual that proves incredibly challenging to forge through any alternate method, yielding a distinct flavor of poise under attack, a distinct flavor of lucidity whenever the stress hits its peak, and a highly cultivated capacity to process whatever an individual is legitimately articulating underneath whatever they seemingly articulate, allowing one to address the actual intent rather than the superficial phrasing. Once Crockett landed in the Capitol and started participating in assembly sessions, it required very little time for citizens who track these events meticulously to realize that she functioned quite differently compared to numerous of her peers. She absolutely avoided acting for the lenses in the manner that numerous representatives utilize, skipping the creation of monologues structured to perform excellently in video snippets rather than legitimately pushing a debate forward. She executed something significantly more traditional and significantly more potent. She was actively constructing lawsuits. She arrived possessing exact comprehension of exact details. She pitched inquiries structured to cement exact details onto the transcript, and she countered disputes not using rehearsed talking points, but using the instant reasoning of an individual educated to process instantly during antagonistic environments. She served ultimately as the exact entity that Jim Jordan's technique remains most susceptible toward and least ready to face, representing an individual who avoids getting flustered by disruptions, who is able to resume a debate precisely where it got severed and proceed as though absolutely nothing occurred, and who comprehends that the disruption itself can easily be converted into ammunition. The session in focus represented the variety that produces friction long before it actually commences. The topic proved civically explosive, the risks remained authentic, and either faction of the assembly entered comprehending that the interactions were destined to carry heavy weight. Jordan launched, relying on his standard manner, framing the parameters fiercely, cementing his faction's storyline utilizing the aggressive poise that derives from decades of executing this inside this exact space, and broadcasting from the absolute initial seconds that he planned to dominate the parameters of the session, signaling that anybody who intended to contest that dominance ought to prepare for a brawl. The initial segment of the session progressed utilizing the cadence that Jordan favors, remaining rapid and combative, featuring his faction cementing their arguments utilizing volume and vigor, while the opposing faction rushed to answer inside the shortened time frames that the speed of his interrogation generates. Multiple interactions unfolded entirely in the manner Jordan had obviously expected. Representatives pushed backward. Jordan spoke straight over them. The second of possible contestation became smothered beneath the aggressive push of the subsequent offensive strike, and the assembly chamber preserved the atmosphere that Jordan had dedicated decades to establishing. Crockett monitored all of this unfolding. She avoided remaining inactive throughout the segments of the session that failed to explicitly include her. She was actively watching, gauging the rhythm, registering precisely where Jordan acted most combative and where he retreated slightly, pinpointing the rhythm regarding exactly when and why he utilized the disruption, and figuring out whatever explicitly provoked it. She was executing exactly what trial lawyers execute whenever they avoid actively interrogating a testifier, thereby collecting data, honing their comprehension regarding the rival tactic, and modifying their personal technique, relying on whatever they are absorbing instantly. By the exact second her opportunity arrived, she had absorbed an adequate amount. She launched her interrogation utilizing an exactness that instantly separated it from whatever had transpired previously. Whereas alternate representatives had launched vaguely, Crockett launched utilizing a highly exact inquiry concerning a highly exact verified detail, representing the style of inquiry that absolutely rejects a vague reply, that avoids being simply parried into broad strokes, and that forces the individual responding to it to either tackle the exact detail or render their dodging obvious. It represented a calculated decision, not purely regarding the content but regarding the tactics, simply because exact inquiries remain significantly tougher to disrupt efficiently compared to vague ones. Whenever you disrupt an individual who is delivering a vague debate, you can occasionally steer the dialogue completely away. If you disrupt an individual who is inquiring regarding a highly exact verified detail, the disruption itself highlights the reality that you are actively avoiding addressing the highly exact verified detail. Jordan comprehended the trajectory she was taking, and he executed exactly what he perpetually executes whenever he comprehends that a sequence of interrogation is heading somewhere awkward. He attempted to break it apart. The disruption arrived while Crockett remained right in the center of steering toward the heart of her inquiry. He sliced right across her, keeping his tone louder than hers, maintaining a condescending attitude and utilizing the phrasing he relies on whenever he desires to broadcast to the space that he views whatever is transpiring as completely unserious, as totally undeserving of authentic participation, and as a detail that can be swatted away utilizing adequate poise and adequate volume. The chamber's focus instantly escalated. This represented the exact second everybody who had been tracking the session had been expecting, whether deliberately or otherwise, serving as the initial instance. The complete power of Jordan's disruption tactic clashed against Crockett straight inside her personal interrogation slot while the entire assembly observed. Crockett halted, avoiding this because she felt flustered, and avoiding this because she lacked the proper words to articulate. She halted utilizing the calculation of an individual who has resolved that the pause itself is destined to serve as a component of the debate. She stared directly at Jordan, lacking fury, lacking the variety of sharp indignation that occasionally appears as theatrics, and merely stared right at him utilizing the tranquil, unwavering concentration of a professional who is preparing to articulate a point they have analyzed incredibly meticulously. The space, which had been operating matching Jordan's favored speed, abruptly slowed down. The chatter ceased, and inside the silence that the pause generated before Crockett articulated a single syllable in reply, a profound shift had already occurred. She vocalized, and whatever she articulated during those initial seconds following the disruption completely lacked any defense regarding her privilege to complete her phrase, completely lacked a plea toward the leader to reinstate control, and completely lacked the variety of structural grievance that appears logical but legitimately surrenders the territory. She recognized the disruption overtly, labeled it accurately for exactly what it represented, and subsequently executed a maneuver that Jordan had obviously failed to foresee. She clarified instantly exactly what the disruption was structured to accomplish and exactly why it was destined to fail. She guided the assembly precisely through the tactic itself, mirroring the manner an educator guides pupils through a sleight of hand following the exposure of how it operates, outlining exactly why the disruption had arrived at the exact second it did, whatever it was designed to halt, and whatever it authentically exposed concerning the fragility of the stance it was designed to shield. It served as an incredible occurrence to witness, completely not because it projected anger or because it proved dramatic, but rather because it represented the logical deconstruction of a tactic, while the tactic remained actively underway, spoken utilizing the tranquil, structured phrasing of an individual who has dedicated decades recognizing precisely this variety of strategic conduct within combative environments and clarifying it for panels and magistrates. Jordan, who had previously been tilting forward utilizing the combative stance he relies on whenever he disrupts, currently sat trapped in the bizarre scenario of functioning as the target of the breakdown instead of the individual steering it. His facial reaction, which individuals occupying the space recounted later utilizing incredibly uniform phrasing, mirrored the reaction of an individual who has utilized their greatest maneuver and witnessed it not merely collapse, but actively be weaponized directly against them. He attempted it anew, executing a secondary disruption that struck fiercer this round, arriving more demanding, carrying amplified volume and projecting a vastly elevated level of condescension. This represents exactly what Jordan executes whenever the primary disruption fails to secure the intended outcome. He aggressively doubles down, primarily because the complete rationale of the tactic relies upon the opposing individual ultimately surrendering, ultimately dropping the focus, and ultimately permitting the interference to triumph. Since the fallback option of preserving poise against continuous hostile disruption proves authentically challenging for the majority of individuals during the heat of the moment, Crockett absolutely refused to surrender. She absorbed the secondary disruption utilizing the identical fashion she had utilized to absorb the primary one, avoiding acting impervious since the disruptions proved factually intrusive and she avoided faking otherwise, but choosing instead to completely reject, permitting the interference to dictate her reply. She hesitated once more, keeping it briefer this round, and subsequently she dropped the phrase, representing the exact rebuttal that the title guarantees and that the title shockingly fails to exaggerate. Whatever she articulated completely lacked the flavor of a witty remark under the traditional definition. It completely lacked the flavor of a biting, solitary sentence that functions perfectly in a vacuum, something capable of being isolated and circulated minus any backstory. It demanded absolutely everything that had transpired prior to it to resonate the way it ultimately resonated. It served as the wrap-up for the debate she had been constructing ever since the exact second Jordan initially disrupted her, functioning as the declaration that grabbed everything she had solidified regarding the disruption tactic, everything she had verified regarding the fragility it was structured to hide, and everything she had showcased regarding her personal refusal to get thrown off track by it, and squeezed it all perfectly into one solitary, exact, crushing remark regarding whatever was legitimately unfolding inside this assembly space and exactly what it signified. The assembly turned motionless, avoiding the courteous stillness of a space-respecting protocol, but rather projecting the authentic stillness of a space where a detail has resonated, carrying such totality that the standard forward progression of the event temporarily halts, since everybody attending remains actively digesting whatever they just absorbed. Jordan, an individual who practically never struggled to locate the subsequent offensive strike, the subsequent disruption, or the subsequent combative push forward, actively leaned backward. The physical posture transition was recounted by numerous individuals who attended, relying on phrasing that proved practically synonymous. The forward tilt transformed into a backward slump, the combative vigor vanished, and the nature of his aura inside the space mutated in the distinct manner that exclusively occurs whenever an individual has collided with a situation they lacked a rehearsed reply to handle, and they remain actively attempting to locate one instantly minus, rendering the struggle obvious. He located vocabulary naturally because he always does. He has been executing this for an adequate duration that he manages to perpetually locate vocabulary, yet the vocabulary he located served as the vocabulary of an individual who has been shoved right off the tactic they arrived intending to execute, and who remains actively riffing from a stance they absolutely never planned to occupy. The hostility remained present, yet the trajectory guiding it had shifted, and inside that shift, the assembly chamber managed to detect that he was entirely finished deploying a blueprint, finding himself instead just reacting. Furthermore, within the atmosphere of these sessions, the gap separating deploying a blueprint from reacting to an opponent's deployment mirrors the gap separating steering the storyline from trailing behind it. Multiple representatives on the panel who had been observing the interaction responded utilizing manners that proved individually noteworthy. Across Crockett's faction, there existed clear acknowledgement, mirroring the variety that arises whenever you observe an individual execute a maneuver you completely grasp the complexity of, and execute it utilizing a talent that wildly exceeds whatever you anticipated. Across Jordan's faction, there existed a revealing lack of the support and backing that his partners typically supply whenever he is driving an offensive strike, happening not because they had deserted him, but rather because they similarly remained actively digesting whatever had recently transpired, completely failing yet to locate the narrative wrapping that would allow them to frame it as anything besides exactly what it definitively represented. Crockett pivoted backward toward her primary inquiry, grabbed it exactly starting at the spot where Jordan's primary disruption had severed it, and proceeded with the debate exactly as though the whole intermediate sequence, featuring the disruptions, the rebuttal, and the quiet, had purely never transpired. This served as potentially the most crushing component of the entire sequence, simply because it proved that the disruptions had accomplished absolutely nothing. They failed to scramble her logic, they failed to derail her debate, they failed to alter the trajectory of her interrogation, and they merely contributed ammunition that she had utilized and subsequently pushed aside, allowing the primary debate to currently proceed along the exact path it had occupied prior to any of the chaos unfolding. The technique that Jordan had dedicated 20 years to refining had gotten absorbed, evaluated, converted into proof, utilized as an exhibit, and subsequently practically bypassed, utilizing a method that rendered it carrying absolutely zero impact upon the result of the interrogation. The session progressed onward. Alternate representatives received their opportunities, the apparatus of the assembly event pushed forward, yet the space felt permanently altered. The atmosphere that Jordan had cemented throughout the initial segments of the session, encompassing the aura of his supremacy over the environment and the speed, had become entangled through a manner that completely refuses to purely reboot between dialogue exchanges. Whenever a space has witnessed a tactic collapse spectacularly, it alters exactly how everybody inside that space views upcoming deployments of that identical tactic. Jordan proceeded to act combative throughout the remainder of the session, proceeding to deploy the instruments he perpetually deploys, yet they struck uniquely and were absorbed uniquely simply because the assembly had currently witnessed a single one of those instruments not merely collapse but get actively torn apart instantly by an individual who made the process appear practically effortless. The video snippet spread the exact second it was uploaded, avoiding circulation via any explicit marketing push or any orchestrated distribution drive, relying instead upon the natural process that triggers whenever a legitimately shocking event unfolds within an open environment, causing the individuals who view it to instantly desire that others view it additionally. Individuals who track civic matters forwarded it to individuals who absolutely ignore them, attaching messages that essentially translated into a variation of demanding that the recipient absolutely must watch the footage. Individuals who had previously remained doubtful that legislative sessions ever generated anything authentic distributed it as proof that occasionally, under the perfect circumstances, featuring the perfect individual during the perfect second, they legitimately managed to do so. The analysis that ensued arrived spanning absolutely every angle. Individuals who backed Crockett legislatively labeled it as one of the most gratifying assembly chamber occurrences spanning modern history, definitely not merely due to the legislative slant, but rather due to the distinct caliber of whatever she had achieved, encompassing the intellect, the background, and the readiness that had rendered the moment feasible. Individuals who backed Jordan, or minimally individuals who generally deem his combative approach potent, remained remarkably quiet throughout their feedback, aiming their justifications heavily upon the core of his legislative stances instead of tackling the interaction itself, which serves as the giveaway that reveals absolutely everything you need to know. Whenever backers cease justifying the distinct occurrence that unfolded and pivot toward alternate territory, they remain actively admitting, minus articulating it overtly, that the distinct occurrence that unfolded simply lacked any defense as a victory for their faction. Judicial experts who analyze legislative transparency published articles regarding the exact core of whatever Crockett had solidified prior to and following the disruptions, encompassing the inquiries she had explicitly pitched, the record she had brought forward, and the transcript she had constructed. They observed that the theatrical components of the interaction, while legitimately momentous acting as an exhibit of tactic and poise, ought not to eclipse the core triumph of the interrogation, which had legitimately advanced the progress regarding authentic matters through manners that carried weight for authentic transparency. Civic academics who analyzed legislative interactions published articles regarding whatever the interaction exposed concerning the viability of disruption-focused session tactics during a timeline where the representatives deploying those tactics find themselves progressively battling interrogators possessing occupational histories precisely tailored to counteracting them. Broadcasting analysts published articles regarding the exact manner the video snippet spread and whatever its model of distribution revealed concerning exactly what viewers legitimately desire from their legislative delegates inside these official environments. Whatever absolutely all of these breakdowns shared, irrespective of the perspective they were utilizing to tackle the subject, remained the acknowledgement that a legitimately momentous event had unfolded, representing something that was not fabricated, not acted out, and not the outcome of a perfectly scheduled audio bite pitched during a second meticulously selected for maximum shareability, but rather the outcome of readiness, background, tactical intellect, and the distinct poise that derives from decades of standing inside legitimately antagonistic spaces while mastering how to execute flawlessly precisely when the stress is actively attempting to guarantee that you fail. Regarding Jasmine Crockett, the occurrence embodies a progression of a momentum that has been mounting ever since she landed in the Capitol. She has transformed over a comparatively brief duration into a solitary member among the representatives whose session involvement the most seasoned legislative watchers consider demanding a complete viewing instead of purely grabbing the summarized moments long after the event concludes. The justification driving that remains precisely whatever this interaction showcased, encompassing the reliability of the tactic, the profoundness of the readiness, the capacity to grab whatever the opposing faction executes and weaponize it instead of purely swallowing it, and the refusal to permit the parameters of the battle to become dictated entirely by the individual sitting across the desk. These represent traits that completely fail to manifest entirely baked. They remain constructed via decades of executing precisely the variety of labor she handled prior to her arrival at the legislature, constantly standing inside spaces where the stress remained authentic, the risks remained genuine, and the talent of the opponent you were battling remained formidable. That specific history completely avoids promising that an individual will act potently during a legislative session, yet it builds the environment beneath which potency remains achievable, utilizing a manner that absolutely zero quantity of broadcast coaching or civic grooming can completely duplicate. Regarding Jim Jordan, this interaction embodies a detail demanding rigorous analysis, absolutely not acting as a legacy-destroying collapse, since one solitary session interaction completely fails to and absolutely shouldn't be interpreted as such a thing, but rather acting as proof highlighting an authentic weakness embedded within the tactic that has outlined his legislative aura across roughly 20 years. The disruption tactic succeeds facing a distinct variety of rival inside a distinct collection of circumstances. It succeeds facing individuals who require unbroken durations to formulate their logic, who become rattled whenever the rhythm of a debate is severed, and who react toward combative vigor by turning protective or hesitant. Facing an individual who underwent training inside antagonistic environments drastically more severe than a legislative session, an individual who is able to grab a debate right mid-sentence following any severing and proceed with it maintaining absolute clarity, and an individual who explicitly comprehends the maneuver being deployed against them thoroughly enough to label it and clarify it instantly, facing that exact individual, the disruption absolutely avoids merely collapsing. It transforms into the opposing individual's ammunition, gets converted into the exhibit proving exactly whatever was being claimed, and leaves the individual who utilized it occupying a more detrimental stance than assuming they had purely permitted the interaction to progress smoothly. That represents the takeaway that this occurrence imparts, and it serves as a takeaway that stretches far past the exact session and the exact individuals participating. Throughout the extensive legacy of legislative transparency, the instruments accessible to influential individuals aiming to dodge authentic transparency have perpetually remained formidable. The capacity to dictate the speed of an interaction, the capacity to utilize systemic power, and the capacity to deploy volume and hostility to forge the illusion of dominance even whenever the core arguments remain fragile represent major tools. Whatever occurrences mimicking this specific one showcase remains the reality that those instruments fall short of being unbreakable, that they can actually be countered, utilizing a distinct variety of readiness and a distinct variety of poise that breaks them apart, minus mirroring their hostility, proving that the absolute greatest counterattack toward a tactic grounded upon severing and supremacy occasionally remains purely functioning as the individual inside the space who absolutely refuses to be severed and absolutely refuses to be dominated, subsequently permitting that reality to turn obvious toward absolutely everybody observing. Jasmine Crockett embodied that precise individual inside that precise space during that precise afternoon, and the assembly that observed her rebuttal sit within shocked quiet comprehended during those brief seconds of tranquility that they had witnessed a detail that entirely fails to occur frequently, representing an authentically fresh addition into the massive transcript documenting whatever remains achievable whenever someone transports the proper readiness toward the proper second inside the proper space. The disruption that was intended to halt her transformed into the occurrence that outlined her and Jim Jordan, an individual who has dedicated 20 years to outlining occurrences for opposing individuals, discovered himself trapped on the receiving end of that dynamic representing the initial instance across a highly extensive duration. The capital recollects occurrences mimicking this one completely, not because they project drama under a shallow interpretation, completely not because they feature elevated tones or structural mayhem or the variety of obvious clashing that produces instant top stories, but rather because they expose a genuine reality regarding the individuals participating and regarding the mechanics of dominance and transparency that dictate these structures. Whatever got exposed throughout this interaction remained factual through a manner that proves challenging to manipulate away, challenging to repackage following the event, and challenging to view spanning any perspective while labeling it as anything besides exactly what it was. Jordan caused a disruption, Crockett answered. The assembly fell completely quiet, and inside that quiet, the narrative regarding whatever had transpired was completely finalized. Assuming this narrative offered you a genuine takeaway, delivering a detail that forced you to process exactly what transparency legitimately resembles whenever it gets executed flawlessly, then smash the like icon immediately, distribute this content toward an individual who desperately requires watching it, and assuming you remain currently unsubscribed, fix that status immediately. We completely refuse to cease delivering you the occurrences that carry weight, bringing the authentic interactions that expose exactly how dominance legitimately functions inside the Capitol, and highlighting exactly who remains legitimately ready to contest it. Subscribe, activate the alert feature, and we shall catch you directly in the upcoming video.